When people see large-scale civilian casualties in a war, it's very tempting to label that as a war crime. This even applies to a lot of military operations conducted by the United States. Frankfurt, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But you need to take a closer look at those situations because the law here is not what most people think. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Quick note, this video comes out of a discussion on a video I posted yesterday about the laws of armed conflict and why targeting civilian infrastructure would be a war crime. If you haven't seen that, I would watch that first because that sets up this conversation. I'll drop a link in the comments below. In response to that video, Scott Graham raised a legitimate point. He pointed to moments in our own history where the United States and allied operations have killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, mostly through strategic bombing. And that is a valid point, because it exposes something that might be a little uncomfortable. This body of law, the laws of armed conflict, can be kind of counterintuitive. You got to keep in mind, the laws of armed conflict generally ask three questions. Distinction. Was this a legitimate military objective? Proportionality. Was the civilian harm excessive relative to the military advantage? And most importantly, intent. Were civilians being targeted as civilians? Was infrastructure being targeted as civilian infrastructure? And it's that last one where most people get this wrong. The examples that Scott raised, Frankfurt, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, are somewhat extreme examples of how these questions can be resolved. Because the actual DIMPs, the direct munitions points of impact that were being targeted in those operations, were not civilian targets. They were industrial centers, transportation hubs, and war-supported infrastructure. So under the law, they were valid military objectives, which means that even with the massive civilian casualties that came along with those operations, those deaths were analyzed as collateral damage, not automatically war crimes. But again, proportionality is one of those major questions that we have to ask. And this is where Scott's point becomes even more relevant in the modern era. Since 1945, and especially after the 1949 Geneva Conventions, there's been a much greater emphasis on proportionality in the laws of armed conflict. And that shift tracks with reality. We now have far more precise weapons, better intelligence, and better targeting. There's no coincidence here. As the targeting technology has improved, expectations on proportionality have also changed. Take the Norden bomb sight during World War II. It was the first widely used system that attempted precision bombing using a mechanical computer. It didn't make bombing precise by modern standards, but it did reflect something important, the expectation that you should be able to hit what you're aiming at. And once that expectation exists, the law follows it. Because one of the factors in the proportionality analysis is the feasibility of your capabilities. As your ability to deliver munitions precisely improves, the legal margin for error shrinks. You don't get to ignore precision that you actually possess. You do actually have to do your best to minimize collateral damage when you are striking a military target. If you have the ability to minimize civilian harm and still achieve your military objective, you are expected to do that. Not as a matter of preference, as a matter of law. Again, war is hell. If your goal is to degrade the enemy's ability to fight, civilian harm, as tragic and terrible as it can be, is generally lawful. If your goal is to make civilian life worse, to target civilians directly, that is a war crime, regardless of your level of technology. This creates a slightly uncomfortable situation in which the same weapons causing the same destruction, but with different intent, can lead to different legal outcomes under the laws of armed conflict. So Scott Graham's point lands. These exemplars force you to confront how imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable this legal framework really is. But if you want to apply the law of armed conflict correctly, you have to ask the right questions. Not just what happened, but what was the objective, and was that objective feasible? War is terrible. It really should be avoided at all reasonable costs. But under the law, brutality alone isn't the crime. Ignoring limits when you don't have to is.